Support of Health and Wellbeing. Part 3. Appropriate Nutrition. Continuing the theme of a proactive approach to health, or what might be termed strengthening the terrain to help prevent disease, let's take a look at an essential element in our approach, which alongside beneficial activity contributes to a healthy lifestyle. Bear in mind that the Western approach to good nutrition ensures ingestion of useful substances that provide energy and building blocks for activity, structure and repair of our body. However, we should also keep in mind, alongside this more gross aspect of our nature, from the Chinese medical theory, so important in the theory of Qigong and Tai Chi, appropriate nutrients supply our more subtle body with Qi, the energy which supports and animates the more subtle body, but consequently its more material manifestation, the physical body. The following will only address the theory with regard to the Western idea of nutrition. I leave the issue of energetic nature of food and so on to those more qualified to discuss it. The following account is offered as part of a proactive approach to health. It's not intended as a substitute for contacting your chosen healthcare provider, your GP, or attending an emergency clinic, or following their advice in the event of developing symptoms of disease. It's offered as one example of a basic guide to engender healthy internal and external conditions in order to resist disease states and improve well-being and self-efficacy. With regard to dietary approaches, it's not definitive, and I'm sure it's not perfect. Neither does it imply criticism of other dietary approaches, or for that matter, moral and ethical positions. I'm sure there are other better and more personally relevant and suitable approaches on offer from those more knowledgeable and skilled than me. Anyway, each person, based on their own view, must choose an approach that satisfies their dietary needs and principles, and hopefully constitutes a beneficial approach to good health and disease resistance. This is a very summarized version of a dietary approach, offered especially for those who may not have or who have little or no understanding of the time-honored approach to a balanced diet. Most of the points discussed can easily be adopted within normal daily routines without being obsessive. Importantly, it's offered to make living healthier and happier, certainly not to make it miserable. There are many reasons for our epidemic of poor health, but no doubt a mindset of abnegation of personal responsibility for one's own health is a major factor. Strongly complicit in this is the willful ignorance or rejection of the preventive or proactive strategies, which is in no small part due to relinquishing of our knowledge of the fundamental principles of health, with the consequent over-dependence on allopathic medicine to extricate us from our often self-inflicted maladies. This fundamental knowledge that we've lost or conveniently forgot is found in such texts as the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which we discussed previously. But we in the West have our own ancient physicians and sages from whom this fundamental knowledge of health is derived, such as the Greek physician Hippocrates, who lived around 400 years before the birth of Christ, and Galen, also Greek, who practiced in Rome some 600 years later. quote, "Let your food be your medicine, let your medicine be your food," is often attributed to Hippocrates, and although not found verbatim in his texts, its meaning and emphases are explicit within them. In our discussion of diet, such aphorisms are fundamental. Although Hippocrates and Galen proposed the humoral and temperamental theories of disease and treatment, including with regard to foods, by the way, they're not entertained within the arrogant and hubristic Cartesian corpus of modern medicine, only to be found within the traditional systems of medical herbalists and naturopaths and the like. However, for our purposes here, we need only to discuss diet from a general viewpoint. Within Hippocrates' texts on food, he points out that in food, excellent medicine can be found. In food, bad medicine can be found. Good and bad are relative. And this is the essential point for us to understand. A nourishing diet is the sine qua non of health and is therefore medicine. And as such, it's all about balance, as QiBo pointed out some 2,000 years before Hippocrates. The idea of correct diet, and by the way, included in Hippocrates' discussion of this is lifestyle and exercise, is the pathway to good health, avoiding the need for reactive medicine. As I emphasized earlier, he points out that the greatest medicine of all is teaching people how not to need it. He drives his point home when he highlights the need for personal responsibility in addressing health, another essential aspect of the proactive approach, which includes attention to one's diet. With regard to any approach to the welfare of others and oneself, we all need to keep in mind, especially doctors and nurses and other medics, we all need to keep in mind Hippocrates' primary dictum, first do no harm. If something is causing harm and the necessary benefits don't outweigh the harm, then something is deeply wrong. We're largely made up of the elements oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and they're found in the body's most abundant and important molecules, including water and proteins and DNA and so on. Other elements are required in small amounts such as sodium and potassium, and trace elements such as selenium and zinc, along with vitamins. The figures you can see on the screen aren't precise, but you get the general idea. Without these major and trace elements and vitamins, the molecules of our body would not hold together, and all the trillions of chemical reactions that occur in our bodies every second, required to maintain functions such as circulation, digestion, and immune function, couldn't occur effectively, and the body would become dysfunctional, or what we call sick, or susceptible to disease. These elements and vitamins are required in optimal amounts within our diet to ensure our body's growth, repair, and renewal. And although the body has a tolerance for deficient or excessive ingestion of these elements contained within the food we eat, over time, abnormal intake would become noticeable in a variety of disease manifestations. So we're made up of all these elements, and these elements are surrounding us. We live within them. Our universe is made up of them. Why would we not think that any imbalance won't affect us? it falls upon us, if we wish to lead healthy, happy lives as best we can, it falls upon us to work within nature and maintain balance within it. But it's important to remember, in the words of Carl Sagan, when we're discussing elements and atoms and things like that, that the beauty of the living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. And that's about balance and harmonious interactions. Just to remind ourselves, with regard to external environmental imbalances that are created often by less than virtuous characters that affect our health adversely. And the major reason I'm offering these active approaches to resist these pathogenic influences is because the manipulation of elements and so-called organisms, especially when injected directly into the organism, is not part of the balance approach. And for many, including our children and babies, it will result in future disease. So, by ingesting nutrients containing these elements in as healthy and natural form as possible, we're effectively nourishing the processes in the body which aid the growth, repair and renewal mechanisms to resist the wear and tear of just living, and to help ameliorate the ravages of time, environmental damage, and the multitude of pathogenic influences alluded to in earlier videos. So it's best to adopt a straightforward and balanced approach to a diet that avoids extremes or faddish ideas. And if attended to in a measured manner, appropriate diet will surely prove efficacious. Many of the diets on offer at the moment, when examined, such as the paleo diet and the keto diet and so on, are much of a muchness and are balanced and beneficial for many people. It's only when emphasis is placed on certain elements of diet at the expense of others where things can go terribly wrong. If you follow a dietary program that keeps you healthy and in fine fettle, that's fine. But the following are generally safe guidelines for a balanced diet, and you should just really try your best to work towards them. However, a word of warning, I'm not advocating it as a substitute for medical dietary advice or necessary medical treatments you might have been given. Also, if you have a specific condition, you should consult an appropriate medical professional before you embark on any special dietary measures or exercise programs. And always consider, by the way, your individual medical history with regard to food intolerance and allergies and so on. However, appropriate diet is nothing more or less than ensuring appropriate, wholesome and effective nourishment for mind and body, and by virtue of that fact, spirit. And to emphasize, avoid fad diets that suggest particular food types at the expense of others. Even before the advent of the internet, one person or another with their arguably narrow and pedantic worldview presented what they no doubt thought sound reasons for criticizing existing nutritional theories in favor of their own. Now, they may or may not have validity, but for sure, sooner or later, someone else will come along and put paid to their theories with a newer, more valid theory. Coming to mind is the Atkins diet, and now the new Atkins diet. Many people will no doubt swear by this new or old or whatever diet for one reason or another. But because it works for them in their circumstances, that doesn't mean it's good for everyone. And you may well be trading short-term gains for long-term problems if the diet lacks appropriate balance. There are several opinions and rationales with regard to dietary ratios of nutrients and reference values and what have you. And depending on the source, of course, and the people they're aimed at, they're massively variable. But for the generally healthy individual, without nutrient-related needs and pathologies and intolerances, keeping your diet roughly within the following general average range with tolerable fluctuations, it's a helpful starting point, especially if your diet's poor. But to reiterate, the range is general and should be adjusted depending on personal needs, preferably with the advice of an experienced dietitian or similar. Here you can see on the screen carbohydrates. Carbohydrates refers to fruit, veg, grains and so on, at least that's what I refer to it as. Proteins refer to substances from sources such as meat and pulses, beans and things like that, eggs and so on. Fats especially refers to saturated fats from meats and dairy and so on. But a proportion of fats should also be unsaturated fats from oils that are as unrefined as possible and so on with regard to these things. Sugary substances, well, I've included this because most people with an unhealthy diet ingest sugar, usually refined, in excess. But sugary substances should be as little as possible, and they should be as unrefined as possible, which means the sweetness is derived largely from an unprocessed source. Some dietitians and what have you, include apples and such in the term sugary substances. Now, they do have lots of sugar in, but I don't include them in that unless you're eating these things in excess. I'm one of the old-fashioned herbalists who sort of still stick to the idea that an apple a day keeps the doctor away, or another one is eating an apple before going to bed will make the doctor beg his bread. Remember, there's nothing inherently bad dietary-wise about all these foods, unless they're poisoned, of course, with chemicals or refined and processed to the point of them being slow poisons. So there's nothing inherently wrong with them, other than if there is an overindulgence or an excess or an addiction to them. Recalling, of course, Hippocrates' advice that in food, excellent medicine can be found. But he also says, in food, bad medicine can be found. Good and bad are relative. Relative, that is, to who's taking it, who's ingesting it, how much you ingest, and its quality. And just to mention again, with regard to the ratios I'm showing here, what I'm using is a synthesis from various sources. But the sources, although they vary, they're much of a muchness, and they're all within a tolerable range. And that range is similar to what I know to have been beneficial for myself, for my family, and for past patients. And in that sense, the information I'm presenting is from experience.
So this video isn't about, have so much of this food type, or this food type's good for this and this is good for that, and so on. There are plenty of books and health gurus around who can provide such information. Of course, you have to be discriminating about some of those individuals and sources. But here, I just want to highlight a useful, what I consider a useful general approach to diet, which most of us plebs with our limited finances and current limitations and capabilities in our lives can fairly easily adopt within this backdrop I've discussed previously of the proactive approach and personal responsibility for health. In brief, other than special therapeutic dietary needs, you should maintain a balanced diet, what you might say a common sense approach to diet. And that should include, of course, as we probably already know, lots of colourful fresh fruit and vegetables, and including in that is healthy herbs and spices, which aid our digestion and so on. Also, quite importantly, you should try to avoid, wherever you can, and even shun them, processed foods, especially the ultra-processed foods that are so colourfully packaged in our supermarkets, whose pictures on the boxes tend towards bearing little resemblance to what is actually inside the packet. Whatever the current view, overeating without necessary activity to utilize the amount of energy obtained from that food inevitably results in obesity. And this, whether we like it or not, is a form of malnutrition which stresses all aspects of our physiology and can more readily lead to disease states. In any case, avoid eating too much of one thing, one food type, or eating too much of anything at any one time. Keep hydrated. Drink sufficient water, as pure and as natural as you can get it. You should ensure complete nutrition. If you're a vegetarian or a vegan, that's laudable, of course. You need to be aware that these diets don't have the easy access to the essential proteins and fats and vitamins and minerals that's readily found in meats. And although many vegans and vegetarians are well versed and well understand the nutritional needs and suitable sources of these nutrients, some are not so aware. And for those this type of diet, vegetarian and vegan, can lead to malnutrition. You should try to avoid excess of any one food type. As we were talking about meat, if you eat meat, you should especially avoid excess of that. If possible, with meat and with all the other food types, you should source them as free from as possible. That's to say, free from substances which are antithetical to good health, and there are lots of them about. If you eat raw whole foods, that's good, especially when you're trying to address a particular health issue. But cooked hot food is necessary and is more effectively digested, so it's especially useful for people who are poorly. It's important to have sufficient wholesome fiber in your diet, phrase I commonly use is keep it moving, because I teach exercise, so that's quite an important factor. But this includes keeping your digestive system moving. If you don't poo easily and regularly, then something is amiss in your lifestyle and or your diet. There might be something clinically amiss, of course, for which you need to consult a health practitioner. But generally speaking, sufficient fibre is essential to digestive health and consequently health in general. When you decide to eat, that's what you should do, eat. There's a common misconception that doing more than one thing at a time is sort of virtuous, and this extends to eating on the move. You know, I haven't got time to have lunch, I'll do this task while I'm eating, or I'll eat my butty on my way to the meeting, or I'll just eat this quickly while I prepare my notes, and so on and so on. This is a form of multitasking. It's not good. It's not a virtue, at least as far as health is concerned. Multitasking is an element of a potentially, or a sign of a potentially stressful lifestyle. And stress is immunosuppressive. So sit down, relax, enjoy and digest the food. Respect it. It was hard come by. Whether you're a vegan or a vegetarian or an omnivore, we need to remember a lot of people have worked hard to produce the food that we're eating. And in fact, many animals and insects have worked hard and even died in the process. Finally, you should enjoy the things you especially like, but in moderation, unless it causes intolerance, allergy, or a reactive condition. Sweetness has always been an important part of our diet, an important aspect of our diet and survival. However, in modern times, we lead more sedentary lifestyles, and we've failed to reduce our attraction accordingly. In fact, it's even got worse because of our sort of hedonistic approach, tendency towards a hedonistic approach. And so we imbibe in sweetness even more than is required. So we ingest it in unhealthy quantities. You should enjoy sweet treats, of course, occasionally, by all means, but you should keep them to an absolute minimum. It's best to derive sweetness from sources as unprocessed as possible. For example, for sweetening foods, you might want to use raw, unpasteurized honey, or perhaps blackstrap molasses, if you can take it. But it's blackstrap molasses has a variety of nutrients in it. But it's best to satisfy your sweet tooth with raw fruits, because your digestive system has to put effort into breaking them down into the sugars, and they take time to be absorbed and are more effectively assimilated and utilized by the body, unlike refined sugars, which are rapidly absorbed and play havoc with our metabolism. But especially, I should just add, avoid sweeteners. They're not healthy. In fact, they're terribly unhealthy, and particularly avoid the terribly unhealthy glucose fructose syrup, which you find in a lot of processed foods in shops and cakes and things like that. Avoid it in all its guises. For example, corn syrup, things like that. So ensuring balanced nutrition then, wholesome nutrition, is important in a proactive approach. And if you have the means to a fresh, organic, balanced diet, that's great. But we all have different lifestyles and financial situations which can inhibit or prevent us from this ideal situation. Most of us are busy getting on with our lives and keeping our heads above water. So it's not always possible to address or afford constant access to a fresh, organic, balanced diet. But with a little effort and a common sense approach, we can attend quite effectively to this aspect of our proactive approach to health and disease resistance. However, for some of us, especially in these times of forced, nutritionally deficient, so-called fresh foods and done-to-death ultra-processed food sources, it's helpful to ensure we have correct nutrition with regard to the important vitamins and minerals, what are called micronutrients, which are often these days deficient in our soil and are certainly lost in the processing of our foods. So regular supplements might be a useful addition. Apart from a high quality general multivitamin and mineral supplement, it's useful to get credible advice on supplementation. So that summarizes the dietary approach. The following videos will address diet in a little bit more detail, along with exercise and so on.